It's 2 o'clock in Sweden. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you find yourself. And welcome to this webinar entitled How Can Development Cooperation Support Climate Action? This is a webinar co-organized between two Swedish institutions, Sida, which I think many of you know, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, which is the government aid agency, and the Expert Group for Aid Studies, which is perhaps less well known. It's an independent committee appointed by the government, tasked to review and evaluate Swedish aid. I am Johan Schar. I'm the vice chair of the expert group, which we call EBA for short. And we're very pleased to have seen so many people register for this event. We are going to put the Paris Climate Agreement at front and center of this webinar, and particularly what was instituted in Paris, namely the nationally determined contributions, which means the independently and voluntarily declared commitments and pledges that countries made to contribute, each one of them, to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We will have a series of brief presentations. And we will begin by asking two Swedish colleagues to make brief presentations of work that has been done to study the alignment of Swedish aid with the Paris Agreement, both looking at the bilateral side and at the multilateral side. Let me introduce to you, first of all, Ulrika Åkesson, who is the lead policy specialist on environment and climate change at Swedish Sida. Please, Ulrika.
Thank you so much, Johan, and really a pleasure to co-organize this event today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions to come. But just to kick us off, I just wanted to talk a bit about Sida's work when it comes to Paris alignment. And as you all know, the Paris Agreement was adopted in Paris in 2015. And in order to achieve the objectives set out in the agreement, all parts of society and the economy needs to contribute. And in the latest letter of appropriation from the government to Sida in 2020, we were instructed by the government to analyze how development cooperation could be even more aligned with the Paris Agreement. And as you might know, there is no common definition on what a development cooperation that is in line with the Paris Agreement looks like. And the issue is still under discussion, and the work that we at Sida have done in regard to this should be seen as a part of that ongoing discussion. And the point of departure for us, for our work, was the Paris Agreement Article 2.1c, which says making finance flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And we choose to analyze three identified important areas more thoroughly. And the first one is on integration of climate changing contributions and programs. And Sida's main tool for integrating climate issues and adhering to the ambitions of the Paris Agreement is mandatory environmental assessment. And this is something that shall be done for all Sida's assessment of programs and contributions to all sectors. And the analysis we did showed that there is a need to continue working with contributions that have been marked as not targeted for the OECD DAC markers for environment and climate. And this we found in order to ensure that these contributions does not negatively affect the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement. So the analysis showed that Sida has the necessary tools in place, but there is a need to increase adherence. So that was one important lesson learned. The second one was on transformative potential. And an analysis was done using the recently released OECD DAC criteria for assessing transformative potential in contributions. And the results showed there that by drawing from experiences of programs that had been assessed by us and marked as having climate change as a principal goal, Sida has a big potential in strengthening the transformative potential of the programs and what we contribute to. However, to get the most out of this potential, there is a need to develop and clarify Sida's tools for doing so. The third area was on normative dialogue, and that there is a possibility for us to take an even higher profile regarding environment and climate dialogue with multilateral organizations, both UN institutions and multilateral development banks. And to do this in an efficient way, there is a need to increase the knowledge of multilateral actors' works on these issues and to push issues in existing fora, and by that advancing the normative dialogue could start a broad process with high impact for increased alignment to the Paris Agreement. And so we will continue work with the results of the findings from that assignment in order to make the work of Sida even more climate relevant. And this year, in our letter of appropriation from the government, we have been given a task to report on the measures taken to ensure that development cooperation is even more in line with the Paris Agreement, and how Sida has developed tools to assess the possibility of transformation. So a lot of important work started off in 2020, and that will continue this year, and hopefully we can move the agenda forward even further. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion with the focus on the NDCs, the key instruments for national climate action. And this is also why we think the focus of today's seminar is so relevant. And I'm sure that this webinar will serve as an important input in making Swedish development cooperation even more aligned with the Paris Agreement, but also to bring the broader climate change work in relation to the NDCs forward. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. And you will come back a little later in the discussion. So thanks. Now I give the floor to Mats Horsmar, who is the Deputy Managing Director of EBA, the Expert Group for Aid Studies. Please, Mats.
Thank you. And as Ulrika talked about the assessment of the Paris alignment of the bilateral Swedish development cooperation, I will talk about the multilateral development cooperation of Sweden and how Paris aligned it is. We took on this challenge of assessing this from the perspective that no organization can any longer be climate blind. Everyone needs to contribute, but not everyone can contribute in the same way. So the various mandates decide what organizations may do and how they may contribute. So we started out by developing a scheme where organizations were assessed against what they potentially may contribute in terms of climate action. 25 organizations were assessed based on evaluations, policy documents, and other publicly available information. Of course, that implied a clear limitation as to what we could say and how deep we could go. Another limitation, as you know, is that there is no common agreed definition of what Paris alignment means. So we tried to position ourselves close to other influential assessments that have been done. So what did we find then? A lot of initiatives and good climate action. Some of the policies and such action is of fairly recent origin and needs to be developed further, but strong ambitions are clearly there in most organizations. However, we also found that the level of climate action varies between organizations that have similar mandates. And there are also variations within some larger organizations. Hence, there's a scope of organizations to rise up to the best standards and learn from organizations with similar mandates like their own. As well, integration of climate action needs to continue within organizations and not remains within specific climate units. For instance, the multilateral development banks have developed joint standards for their Paris alignment, whereas the practice still differ in important areas. So learning across organizations, across the MDBs is possible. Similar differences in practice were noted between organizations with humanitarian mandates, as well as with health-related mandates. A common thread in our study was the importance of national ownership and, of course, then the national determined contributions. Ndcs should be key instruments for natural climate action. And this is why we think this seminar is so relevant. The Ndcs contain a wide set of themes and issues, and all international organizations may in them find space and role for their specific contributions. But it's essential that national governments drive these processes. A key feature of the Paris Agreement is the bottom-up process, where nations contribute with constantly increasing ambitions towards lower greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilience. Another finding in our study is that the concept of socio-economic transformation is very elusive, while at the same time key within the Paris Agreement. More work is needed on the operationalization of socio-economic transformation. It should not remain what we say a semantic magnet, that is, a phrase used and liked by everyone, but without clear meaning. It should be translated into concrete action. So our report is available for anyone who'd like to read at www.eba.se.
Thank you very much, Mats and Ulrika, for giving us this kickoff with a kind of assessment of the still, if you allow, unrealized potential of both bilateral and multilateral development cooperation in terms of Paris alignment. I forgot to say that those who participate are free to ask questions throughout the session, so please use the Q&A function to do that. And we already have a question, I see, about Sida's bilateral support, and I think we'll come back to that when we come to the panel a bit later on. I think Ulrika Åkesson will address that. So just to make sure that we have the same kind of understanding of what we are talking about here, what are the nationally determined contributions? We have asked Catherine Diamvalla at UNDP, she is the climate change technical specialist in New York, to give us a sort of run through what is it that we are talking about here. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Johan. I have a few slides for my presentation. I will just wait a minute. Great, thank you. So thanks again for having me on this call. I think this is a very, very important webinar. We've been trying for several years now to put nationally determined contribution at the heart of climate action in general, but also at the heart of development. So I think this is a very, very important discussion to be having today. So I will just take you back in time and just provide some background on the NDCs. As we all know, the NDCs are part of the Paris Agreement, which was adopted at COP21 back in 2015, and later entered into force a year later in 2016. The Paris Agreement has been ratified by 190 parties to date, and it sets key principle for reducing our global emissions in order to prevent temperature rise above 2 degrees Celsius. But we all know that the goal is actually 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's why countries are invited to revise their NDC every 5 years, so we can ultimately reach that goal of avoiding global temperature to rise above 1.5 degrees. National determined contribution are the principal mechanism for achieving the goal of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So the basics on NDC, what are NDCs? They are commitment taken by countries that sign the Paris Agreement to reduce their greenhouse gas emission. Typically, to develop an NDC, a country would look at its economic sectors, mostly in general, the sectors that are the most polluting and the one that offer the highest potential of reducing emissions. In the countries that, in most of the countries we work with, and this is of course data from the Climate Promise, which is an initiative of UNDP supporting 118 countries right now. What we are seeing is that those sectors that countries mostly focus on are energy, agriculture, land use, transportation, and waste. Some countries, and this is becoming more of the norm, some countries do include adaptation measures in their NDC. So it's not just about reducing emissions, it's also about climate change resilience. NDC, as I said earlier, should be updated every 5 years. And again, the goal is to be more ambitious every time. So every new NDC should be more ambitious than the previous one. The majority of the first generation NDC, that's how we refer them internally, were submitted in 2015. So 2020 was the first time that these NDCs were going to be renewed. But because of the delay caused by the pandemic, some countries have now pushed that submission date to the COP26, hopefully in November of this year. 190 parties have submitted their first NDC. Right now, there are 77 countries that have submitted their updated NDC or new NDC. Some countries, very few countries who did not submit the first time, have submitted last year, late 2020. And we are expecting 96 countries to submit their NDC by the end of this year. So this is data we're getting from, again, from the Climate Promise and also from the UNFCCC. There are a few countries who have not indicated whether they are going to submit or not, and about 3 countries that said that they will not be submitting. Next slide, please. So what's in the NDC? As you know, there is no standard format for the NDC. It is a country-driven process, and the Paris Agreement gives liberty to countries to basically decide what should be in their document. But of course, that has caused some problem because it's really difficult to compare from NDCs from one country to another, to compare the data and to see how far or how close we are to the objective. So back in 2018, the ad hoc committee on the Paris, the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement put out some guidelines on what the minimum amount of information that should be in an NDC to increase clarity, transparency, and understanding. So the first one is NDC should have quantifiable information on the reference point. And that means when a country says that it will reduce by, let's say, 25%, it should indicate compared to what level and justify why that level was chosen. The second point is the time frame. and the period of implementation. So it could be a single year target or a multi-year target. For instance, a country may say, I will reduce my emission by 20% by 2025, and maybe by 30% by 2030. The third point is about the scope and coverage. So here, the sectors that are covered should be indicated. The sectors that are excluded should be indicated. The geographical coverage should also be indicated. Some NDCs are regional, others are nationwide, so all that information should be there. The fourth point is about planning processes. So any planning processes related to laws, policy, the institutional framework, any stakeholder consultation that took place in developing the NDCs to achieve the objective. Any relations to long-term strategies that exist should be also made clear in the NDC document. So the fifth point is about assumption and methodological approaches. So this is about how GHG emissions are accounted. Is IPCC data used? Where's the data coming from? Is it national data? Is the country intending to engage in market-based approaches in voluntary cooperation under Article 6? Any national mitigation measures that the country intends to take. The final point is about fairness and ambition. So this is the country should state and justify how the NDC is fair and ambitious, how it compares to its previous NDCs, and what's the relation of the NDC with its long-term development strategy, if that exists. Next slide, please. So of course, that was the guideline, the few guidances given by the ad hoc working group. And in addition, several organizations set out to provide more guidance to countries. UNDP being one of them, we work with WRI to release a guideline for enhancing NDC. And in this guideline, we talk about the process, we talk about the opportunities for raising ambition, and both on adaptation and mitigation. And we also provided specific guidance on different sectors, the sectors that, again, come up the most. We also have an NDC Quality Checklist. So this is to help countries just be aware of what they should be taken into consideration when they do their NDC. And this checklist focuses on the robustness of the NDC, the ambition, and the feasibility of the NDC. So as another example of guidance, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list, the Africa Group of Negotiators, for instance, released a template for countries, for African countries to use if that was suitable for them. Next slide, please. So here, I'm just gonna speak about what happens, well, after we submit the NDCs, what we are seeing here at UNDP as the success factors for an NDC. So after we submit, the real work starts. And from our experience, these 8 points put together are key to move from commitment to action. The first one is about alignment of the NDC with the development priorities. So it doesn't matter how beautiful the document is, how clear, how ambitious it is. We've found that if it's not embedded in the development priorities of the countries, it stands little chance of being implemented. And this is because countries allocate their budget based on their development plan, they fundraise based on their development plans, and NDCs cannot be parallel processes. If they remain parallel processes, their implementation becomes very, very difficult. The second point is a high-level political buy-in. So of course, in most countries, the ministries of environment are the focal point for the NDCs. They usually drive the process. But when it comes to implementation, the countries need a higher level to direct the different sectors, the different ministries that are priorities in the NDC to take on the NDC and implement it. And most of the time, that direction must come from either the office of the president or the office of the vice president. The third point is the whole of government approach. This is, the third point is about strong coordination mechanism. And this is about also the different ministries and the different sectors working together. Again, this is no longer just the business of the Ministry of Environment. Everybody has to be involved. Whole of government approach. Here we really insist on the involvement of the ministries in charge of finance, budget, and planning, just because they are the one holding the purse and they are also the one managing the planning processes. So if they are not involved, it becomes a bit difficult for implementation. The whole of society approach, again, this is connected to the first one, but this is making sure that no one is left behind, making sure that all the major stakeholders are aware of the NDC and participate in the NDC, and that the NDC measures also benefits them. The next point is about clear understanding of cost. So most of the first generation NDC didn't include cost, or they were very rough numbers. So it was really difficult to understand how much it would cost to implement an NDC. And of course, when you don't understand how much it costs, it's hard for you to raise the funding necessary to go with it. The next point on MRV system. This is also a huge gap right now. Most of the countries that we work with, they have no idea what they have achieved since 2015. They don't know what's implemented. They don't know how close or how far they are from their targets. So having this monitoring system is crucial to knowing how we are doing overall. Finally, the most important part, financial resource mobilization. And I think it's very interesting we're talking about this today. How do we make sure that these measures get the financing that they need, both from the national budget, but also from development cooperation and private sector and so on. Next slide, please. I'm gonna end with this slide, and this is just to provide just brief information on the climate promise. We are currently supporting 118 countries. I think Ulrika will tell us a little bit more about what we are doing there. We're working with 35 partners. 28 of these countries are SIDS, small island development state. 14 are considered high emitters, 38 as are least developed countries, and 45 are conflict affected countries. I will stop there and happy to take any question later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think that was a very good foundation for the continuation of our discussion today. Let me just see if I can get, could we? Okay. Yes. So we now have a panel which is going to comment from their different perspectives on implementation and support to NDCs. Excuse me. And the panel consists of, we have 4 people. First, we have Ms. Pacifica Acheng Ogola, who is the director of the climate group at the Ministry of the Environment in Kenya. We then have Ulrika Moder, who is the Assistant Secretary General at UNDP. I have to tell you that she is also a Swedish national, and there are women in Sweden who are not called Ulrika, if anyone wonders. And then we have Luis Tineo, who is the Lead Operations Officer at the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, placed at the World Bank. And then Ulrika Åkesson, who made the first introductory presentation, will come back and comment a bit more from the perspective of Sida. But I'd like to give the floor first to Pacifica. But before doing that, I'll just mention, if anyone would like to sort of reflect on that when you make your comments now, a few of the questions that we have received. We have been asked, for example, to what extent does COVID-19 influence countries' ability to actually formulate their NDCs and implement them? We have a question about gender justice. To what extent is that a part of the NDC exercise? And thirdly, we have a question on non-state actors. To what extent are they included as important implementers of climate action and NDCs in particular? But let me first give the floor to Pacifica to comment from the perspective of Kenya. And I asked a few questions in advance to our panel to think about NDCs from three different perspectives. And the first one being, to what extent does the NDC actually function at the national level as a sort of coordination mechanism or for an arena for all actors to come together, the kinds of actors that Catherine highlighted? Does it work? Are there processes and actors who find themselves outside of the NDC articulation process? Also, what kind of support do countries receive to formulate and implement their NDCs? And we've heard part of that answer, I think, from Catherine in the introduction. But we also need to look at climate finance. To what extent do different support development partners actually coordinate between themselves in providing this support? And thirdly, what about the interplay, the dynamic between external supporters and the national implementing actors? Is there ever a risk of sort of limited ownership at the national level if international actors are sort of too active in pursuing this? But please help us understand these aspects, Pacifica, from the Kenyan perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, Johan. I hope you can all hear me. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the presenters who have already made their contributions before this presentation. So in response to your first question, whether NDC functions at a national level, the case of Kenya is yes, the NDC provides overarching goals for mitigation and adaptation actions by setting the priority areas for sectors. And of course, this process is both a bottom-up and a top-down approach. Once the priority areas are set, the sectors then develop strategies and action that can be undertaken to achieve the NDC goal. And I'll just give an example. For example, if we have a target in reducing emission in the energy sector or maybe in a building resilience, then the relevant sectors come up with a project pipeline which they submit. And this also actually aligned with a medium-term planning process and also a process of implementing our Vision 2030. Because this has been easy for us, especially in the third medium-term planning process, because climate change was identified as a cross-cutting issue in the medium-term planning before the planning started. We tried to develop some guidelines that to help the sectors to effectively mainstream, but I also believe that there's a lot of room for improvement in that. So bottom-up, top-down approach, we give the goals, and the sectors also meet the obligations through those goals, and this also is enhanced through the Climate Change Act, which requires all sectors and actors to mainstream climate change in all the development process and also report on an annual basis. So we have not started the official reporting process, but we've been doing a national assessment of where we are in terms of implementation by sector. And the coordination element, the Climate Change Directorate is the lead agency that is mandated to coordinate climate action in the country by law. However, we work very closely with the National Treasury and planning because the Treasury, our colleagues in Treasury are the ones who are mandated to approve all climate finance, and they're also the lead in terms of coordinating and reporting on climate finance. So we have a very close-knit working relationship, and our roles and responsibilities are defined in the Climate Change Act. When it comes to the kind of support that we are receiving in formulating and implementing NDCs, and whether that support is sufficiently coordinated between development partners, I can say that for the NDCs and the National Climate Change Action Plan that implement the NDCs, we mostly receive bilateral support in form of technical assistance. I think, for example, we have received from a GIZ NDC partnership, also supported by USAID through the UNDP process. And then for implementation of the climate action, actually this is sourced at the sector level through various channels. This can be bilateral, multilateral, and all forms of a mix of financing mechanism, depending on the scope and the size and the magnitude of the project that is being supported. And in Kenya, we have started the coordination process of development partners that are in climate change action. We started this, I think, some 3 years back, and we are now continuing with the process, and our current chair is actually Sweden. And I think through this process, we'll be able to coordinate activities and also work closely with the National Treasury to see how much is mobilized and who is implementing what, and whether we are channeling resources in the right areas of action. As to whether there is the international ambition for climate finance is too high in supporting NDCs, I would say that international ambition, and this is, in my opinion, is not high because most of the developing countries are still trying to implement NDCs, which are extremely expensive. For example, if you look at our most recently updated NDC, we require $62 billion US dollars to implement the NDC fully by 2030. And this is just Kenya alone. And I also think the recent adaptation gap report that was released by UNEP in January, they also gave some figures which indicate that the international ambition on climate finance is actually low. And if you're going to meet the 1.5 degree or 2 degree C that is articulated in the Paris Agreement, then climate finance, we need to close the climate finance gap, especially when it comes to adaptation actions. And in some cases also, I think in most high emitting countries, they also need some additional investment in order to reduce emissions so that we all achieve our common goal of reaching 2 degrees by 2100. But the UNEP emission gap report that was released here actually confirmed that we are on a 3 degree rise. So I think that for us to go to our destination, international climate finance, the ambition needs to be raised a bit. It's not high at all. I think if you look at after the synthesis report has been done by UNFCCC, we'll be able to know also what countries require to implement their NDCs. And if there is risk of limited national ownership, if the processes are driven by outside experts, to that I would respond that it actually depends on the nature of assignments, because there are some assignments where we will need very high level technical experience or tools in order to get the results that we desire. I can say a case in point like the long-term strategy that we are currently developing, which requires a lot of modelings for macroeconomics, climate modelling, and also mitigation action modelling and adaptation. We need at least some people with international experience, and for that, we don't have a problem. But with this international experience, we also welcome international experts to work with the local partners so that the knowledge is left behind, and that in the process of this assignment, that there's also some capacity building of local teams to carry out implementation of the assessment and even to update the work beyond the international expert assignment. And in doing this also, and for sustainability, we also advocate a learning by doing approach. And I think one of the areas where we have succeeded in doing this is that we had an international expert come and train our greenhouse gas inventory team, and the team itself generated the third greenhouse gas inventory. So the third greenhouse gas inventory was actually developed by Kenyans, but it was based on learning by doing approach. So we are open to a blend of options, but also to ensure that we don't lose out on the learning part. It is also worth noting that we have spent many years in building local capacity to carry out implementation of climate action. And as much as possible, it's also a good idea to give priority to the national experts where that is possible. There are case in points where we see projects or information which we have already done a lot of work and we have background information where a local expert would be able to compile that information very fast and give us a report. And for that, we may not need an international expert. So a blended approach for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. I think this gives us a very good picture of how this work actually happens in a national context in Kenya. And it's a relatively positive picture in terms of the processes and the engagement and so on from many different actors. But of course, you also point out that we are still far away from sufficient financial resources to implement our aspirations. So I'm going now to go to Ulrika Moder, and perhaps also just note that yesterday the UN Security Council actually had a session on the security implications of climate change, which gives us a very sort of stark background to what we are discussing today. But over to you, Ulrika.
Thank you, Johan. And I was actually about to mention that because, of course, many of you on this call know about UNDP and our work, and you would know that we are a development program of the UN. And as we need to make a climate promise, that also needs to kind of be paired with a development promise. And it's interesting to note as we do that the work that we are doing within climate change, but also environment and nature at the heart of development has really also come to the heart of the work in the UN. And as you were saying yesterday in a briefing in the Security Council, something that we have seen coming, but it wasn't a given. But it also tells us that we are in a really critical moment in time. The understanding is there, but yet even those of us working within this field haven't found really the ways to move things forward. And I was thinking as I was listening to Ulrika also with regard to the study in Sweden, that it's not even in Sweden, you know, we have the frameworks in place for the Swedish International Development Corporation, but not yet fully integrated. However, I think we are well on our way. And of course, this conversation is an important conversation to learn, as we also heard now also from Kenya and from Ashing. There are things happening, and also perhaps to comment just briefly before I go into UNDP's experience. I mean, as I know Sweden also, even a well-developed country with climate change at the forefront of government priorities, haven't fully until just recently found its way to actually have a whole of government approach. I think it was just recently at the end of last year that the Prime Minister decided to have a council with the ministers who are most engaged and need to be part of the rollout also of the work. And also listening to Ching and the need for climate finance. I mean, yes, these programs are very costly. Adaptation, many of the measures that need to be taken in any country of the world are very costly. And thus, I think that politically it is important, and that's perhaps why UNDP has also become kind of a center actor in all of this. It's important to be able to come forward with an idea that is both a climate promise, but also promise for development, and that we can, as we've heard here, learn from. I mean, I think the NDC Global Network, really our NDC and climate promise, but also the NDC partnership makes us have a unique opportunity, I would say, to learn from the different experiences in different countries, use experts from different countries and so on to enhance the work and really make it this whole of government approach that we would need. We also had the question in the chat box, is it possible to do this in times of the pandemic? And I would just like to say that, of course, we, having rolled out the idea of a climate promise to support any country that would need support, we were asking ourselves that question. But throughout the pandemic, our NDC support program, our climate promise, has worked really well, I must say, of course, with some delays, but most countries, I mean, they were really convinced that they had to enhance their NDCs and take this possibility to also get the support from the international community to do so. Around 2/3 of the climate promise countries that we are supporting, the 118, as Kathy said, have delayed the timelines, but then also the COP is delayed, so it gives us also, and it's only actually mostly for a couple of months. More than half of the climate promise countries are indicating their intention to make bigger greenhouse gas cuts. And you saw the map presented by Kathy and the variety of countries that we see. Some are taking time to adjust and reevaluate, leveraging their revision process, helping them then to design and organize, but also the finance. And I think that this is incredibly important in this second batch of NDCs, that they can also be accompanied with more realistic financing planning. So we have seen countries such as Nigeria, Tunisia, Serbia, Chile, and Indonesia, big countries, also big emitters nowadays, even though not as big as many countries in the global north, promote the linkages between their economic plans, also their economic recovery, which is of course very interesting, also with regard to the question we had on the socioeconomic situation that is following and accompanying the pandemic that we're in the midst of, and that will also be part of the reality to come for many, many years. I mean, we also have a looming debt crisis that we are not mentioning as much as we should, perhaps, as we speak about the socioeconomic crisis following also the pandemic. But with these examples and really some really important countries, we can tell that yes, there are countries that are looking into how to make this crisis also an opportunity and make those close linkages between the economic recovery and the climate ambition, and those turning these words that we many times express in our national, international seminars into action. We are working with a lot of partners, and you saw the NDC partnership, and that makes it possible for us to really tailor also the support to the government needs to work with what we have all said in this call so far and what we have learned, and that is the importance of having the national ownership and really be able to build our support and our technical support to the needs on the ground. This is a really good time to invest in the green transition, and we need to make use of this economic crisis that we're in to really speak about the importance of the green recovery, the green investment, and put them at the center of the discussions as countries are looking for the jumpstart. Now, speaking about jumpstart, some countries have that possibility, many don't. So then, of course, we need also to look at how we support countries with international financing. And this will, of course, be, as it always is, a very critical part of the discussions ahead and during the Conference of the Parties that comes up now. Now, I think many of us have already said, but just to stress, what we see, of course, is that many countries that we support, most countries, I would say, also developed countries, so-called developed countries. I'm thinking about our latest Human Development Report, where we're questioning what is actually a developed country, taking into account also climate change and environment. It's certainly true that many of countries are working with a very siloed approach with regard to forest management, biodiversity, water management, land conservation, agriculture, renewable energy, and so on. And what we advise countries as part of our climate promise is to see that the NDC can become that umbrella strategy that can bring everything together. And then we want to kind of push the NDC at the heart of planning, as has been said already, but also at the heart of the budget planning. UNDP works with an integrated national financial framework. We do that also in coordination. It's part of the financing for development process, but a lot of support also from the EU, and an increasing interest. Will be interesting to hear from my World Bank colleague, also from some of the development banks, to see if we can also use these integrated national financial frameworks also to enhance also the work of the NDCs through that integrated planning. To embed this into the national planning process, to embed it into the budget process is critical. Seen in some of the NDCs, and I think Catherine maybe can provide us, so there was also a question in the chat where we have some best practices, but of course not in everyone, and this goes for all countries alike, north, south, east, west. I think, however, and something that has not been mentioned already, what is important, and perhaps it will be mentioned by my World Bank colleague, what is also a possibility is to use the Helsinki principles. The Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action launched in early 2019 principles. I think that there is a need for us from the development side to also provide them with more tools, more ideas into their toolbox. UNDP will, in some few months, come forward with a campaign on fossil fuel subsidy reform, something, of course, mentioned many times, but where we also put forward some concrete ideas and some technical support, but also some political ideas, how you can actually divest from these subsidies and invest in social protection, thus linking it to the necessities that we have seen throughout also our leadership in the socioeconomic assessments and recovery plans, and where we believe that we can also learn from each other as an international community, how we get also the political buy-in with regard to some of these important reforms, whether they are about taxation or any other of the reforms that needs to be put in place, also to enable also the funding, the national funding for the national ownership. We believe that there is a possibility to do shifts there that could also be important for some of the really critical reforms. Private sector engagement has been mentioned and will probably also be mentioned, is of course incredibly important. We see less of foreign direct investments. UNDP works also in parallel with our climate promise with something we call the SDG impact, where we want to drive impact investments, and where we also do maps, also supporting countries also to find bankable projects where we can also direct foreign direct investments and encourage now, as we see a decreasing flow of foreign direct investments also as a result, not least to developing countries in the global south. Once again, speaking to the importance of climate finance and many of these projects, as was mentioned, being very expensive and the need to be realistic with regard to this. So the mapping of both public and private funding is something that we need to support. UNDP as part of this, but we need to do it in a coordinated way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'll leave it like that. Thanks, Johan.
Thank you so much. And I think what you're telling us is a story about we are getting there, a bit slow. Some of the nuts and bolts are sort of coming into place. The ministers of finance and so on are coming on board, but we are clearly not yet at the moment of transformation. So we are not yet where we need to be. And having said that, Luis, let me turn to you, because you look at this, I would think, particularly from a kind of extreme events perspective, and some of the most sort of dramatic dimensions of what climate change actually means. So how do you see your role in relation to the nationally, to the NDCs?
Thank you, and Johan. And I guess that we have full alignment with UNDP, and I can relate to the points mentioned by Ulrika and Catherine, both in terms of the framework to approach NDCs and in terms of the specific areas of priorities. Most recently, in the World Bank, we are right now in our climate change action plan for 2021-2025. And these are the critical years, right? And these are the years for the next cycle of NDC and enhancement. So for us in the World Bank, it's becoming more and more important to emphasize and raise the visibility and support to NDCs. But NDCs is just one part of the process, right? I mean, I guess that in the World Bank, for some in the audience, we are an institution that is now delivering $160 billion in COVID-19 recovery packages support. And this is the critical driver. We are using the recovery packages to enhance the NDCs and introduce even, more ambition in the context of long-term strategies. As we in the audience and practitioners know, these next 5 to 6 months are critical leading into COP26. And frankly, what we see is that the process is being slowed down by the COVID crisis, and this is a logical situation. But at the same time, the countries are realizing that the green recovery is a good idea, building back better and using, limited resources in support of the recovery can lead into important entry points for decarbonization. So in the bank, we are taking a deep look at this, and we are adjusting our country strategies. But there are things that we want to emphasize, and I think that we can share this with you. The first is many people, demand from our client countries or developing countries to elevate climate ambition. And this is something that we really think that needs to be evaluated, both from those of us, multilateral or bilateral agencies supporting countries, to understand clearly what the targets are and how to assess the capacities of countries to engage in this. So, for example, the World Bank is investing heavily, particularly this year, in understanding the country's primary greenhouse gas sources, particularly in energy, transportation, and agriculture, and whether the NDCs include the local context appropriate plan and the reforms associated with that. Ulrika mentioned, and I support this, the issue of climate finance gaps. One thing is the ambition, and another whether countries have the financial capacity to meet the ambition. Here is where obviously the World Bank as a financial institution has a role to play, but at the same time, it's an issue of helping countries understand what the long-term climate risks they face are. We are developing a system of a resilience rating system to make sure that the ambition and the financing available meets exactly the critical points of the transition. So we are assessing also whether governments have the institutional and market context to support the decarbonization plans. For example, here we are still talking about the resilient goals and strategies for mitigation, but most likely adaptation. Adaptation is still not at the level of ambition that it's required. And we in the bank would like to go in parity, in the 50-50 in terms of our financing. That obviously COVID recovery has plenty of opportunities for us to engage in not only mitigation, but a lot in adaptation. And we want to enhance our capacity there. Having said this, in the World Bank, we are partnering with the UNDP through the Ndc partnership. And for that, we have two dedicated vehicles to support the countries. One is the Ndc support facility, which is currently supporting 50 countries, 34 of them in the Ndc enhancement process heading into Glasgow. And we are also supporting, as Ulrich had mentioned, the coalition of finance ministers. We feel that the coalition is the right place at this point to integrate both priorities for COVID recovery and Ndc and LTS processes. So the work of the coalition, both in Principle 1 and particularly Principle 6, to address the issues of governance, financial management, budget, procurement, and form are critical for us, and we are engaged deeply into that. So in short, I think that the World Bank framework, it's quite at this point mature enough, following 5 good years of practice to meet the demands of countries. The ambition remains the critical point. And again, you know, the issue of coordination of climate finance. That relates to the Paris alignment and the methodologies that we are using to integrate the multilateral development banks financing and see if we can reach the ambition for us to be climate informed at 100%, both 50-50 mitigation and adaptation. I hope this is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. That's comprehensive and it's good. And you use the word maturity. We've a few years of experience now in building these kinds of capacities and support mechanisms. So, and of course, the fact that we now have a certain member state rejoining the Paris Agreement is clearly important in the view.
Johan, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague from Uganda, who we are supporting. I think that we have a great partnership with Uganda, in particularly in the context of public financing.
Thank you. Now we go back to Ulrika Åkesson. Ulrika, would you like to now sort of again look at this from a Swedish Sida perspective?
Thank you, Johan, and I think a lot has been said by now that I really just agree on, and I know that there are many questions to be addressed and discussed. So I'll try to keep it short, but just to try to answer the questions you put in the beginning on. I just want to say from Sida's side, I think what we see in general is that NDCs, of course, have a central role to play, and usually there is an interest from the government side, that the governments we work with, but that doesn't mean, of course, that it's easy. And I think that national commitments that countries have made, they need to be anchored and owned by national structures, and many have said that, and included in the national development plans. And just to give an example, I think talking about Uganda, also I heard from colleagues that the National Planning Authority integrated emission targets in the national plan, but also broke it down on a sectoral level. And I think by working this way, it shows how important it is to include and coordinate with sectors who are responsible and then work to develop laws and regulations for a proactive way ahead. And also as a result of this, I think in that particular case, the National Development Plan is now broken down per sector on a yearly basis. And I think this example just shows how the NDC process needs to be operationalized in national structures. And another important thing that I wanted to mention is I think there's such a need for the NDCs to connect between national and local level. And some sectors are very decentralized, like, for example, agriculture in Kenya. Then there is a real need in the NDC work to incorporate the national, but also the middle and local levels. We usually talk about national and local levels, but there is also something in between there that I think is key for the NDC work. And I think that the NDCs also become more owned by all levels of society if they're taken to consider all these levels, and not only become a UNFCCC document. And also by doing so, I think you get the good involvement from the finance and planning ministries. But also, another thing I wanted to mention is that I think there are many ways to get support for the NDC work. And I mean, that has been shown today, and through the GCF readiness, the NDC partnership, the NDC support program, and so forth. But I think there's definitely room for improvement. I think donors could do much more when it comes to coordination and deepening and working more on structures at country level. But there is also a role for countries themselves to push and involve and coordinate with donors working to move the whole NDC process in the right directions. And I think also that donors can support, but ownership must exist by the countries for an overview of support, and then also to be able to say no and analyze what the gaps are. And I think there's definitely different types of homework to be done given our very different roles that we have. And then finally, I just also wanted to say that I think that the NDC processes in general need time to develop in the pace needed by the countries themselves in order to become long-term and sustainable. I think it takes a lot of time to operationalize and anchor the work, which can't be done by quick fixes with consultants doing the job. And it was referred to that sometimes, maybe, I think it was Pacifica saying that sometimes the competence or capacity is not there, and you need certain input to the process. But what I have heard, at least, is most often it is needed to have more in-house staff at the ministries who can work with the NDCs for ownership, and maybe go beyond, also not only focusing on negotiations that often is prioritized. But there is a need, I think, for staff to push for the work nationally. And another important need, and I mentioned that before, of the local ownership of the processes, the NDCs. And I think that what the Global Commission on Adaptation developed by the locally led principles for adaptation, those kind of principles could also be very useful in the NDC process as well. And the need to have money and responsibility, including ownership from national to local level, is also very, very important. Then lastly, I just also wanted to say that not only having the right ministries involved, and that has been mentioned several times by others, but also cooperating closely and having civil society on board with an enabling environment for their participation, I think, including also the youth and other groups in society, is of course key for successful NDCs. But let me stop there, and then we'll have time to move into questions. Thank you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. Yes, we have a number of questions. And before going to those, I'd just like to draw your attention to what I think is a very important paper that was published just a few weeks ago. And this is a group of 20 researchers who have looked very closely at the sort of first generation of adaptation projects. This group is led by Siri Eriksson from Norway and Lisa Schipper. It was published in World Development. The paper, and I'll ask Mats to give us the link to this paper. It's entitled Adaptation Interventions and Their Effect on Vulnerability in Developing Countries, Help, Hindrance, or Irrelevance. And what they find is a fairly bleak picture, and they've summarized their findings under in sort of four sets of conclusions. The first one being that there's a shallow understanding of the vulnerability context, which is often viewed in a much too local perspective, not looking at the sort of global dimension of impacts. Secondly, they find an inequitable stakeholder participation in both design and implementation of projects. Thirdly, they find what they call a retrofitting of adaptation into existing development agendas, which means basically business as usual, but calling things adaptation or climate action. And then finally, a lack of critical engagement with how adaptation success is defined. So their sort of overall conclusion is that if we think about transformation as a restructuring or replacement or even abandonment of systems and practices that no longer work under climate change, we are not yet there. So there's still a way to go. And I think the emphasis on learning within organizations and between organizations and with partners in country is really critical at this stage. So I encourage everybody to have a look at this. I think it's a great piece of research that is very much needed for all of us. We have many questions, and I would like to have time to ask a few of them. One is, if I could ask UNDP, either Ulrika or Catherine, there's a question about South-South learning and South-South cooperation. To what extent does UNDP encourage that in your support to developing countries?
We do, but I'll hand over to Catherine to answer.
Yes, actually, I was going to take that. I just answered that in writing, but I will share it here live. We are supporting 118 countries, and South-South cooperation is really at the heart of what we do. We organize calls, discussion, anything that the countries want, mostly at the regional level, because we find that our countries really want to learn from other countries within the region. And these are basically, they are based on different themes. So we had a lot on gender, which is something that a lot of countries wanted to integrate this time around. We have discussion on private sector engagement, on youth engagement, on costing, on whatever topic the countries are asking for, and also sectoral focused discussion. So yes, we do that quite a lot, and it's very much appreciated. And it's really helping countries to move forward, learning from each other's experience.
Thank you. There was also another question to, while UNDP is speaking about water sanitation, WASH, to what extent is this an element in what you are supporting?
So we are supporting water in general. I cannot think of an example of a WASH, but what we are supporting on water is mostly the impact of climate change on water resources to be added to the adaptation part. Some countries are also interested in the mitigation aspect of water. So water as resources that uses a lot of energy, and what are the impact of that on the emission of the country. Others are looking at coastal area, blue economy, but I cannot point to WASH in particular, not in the countries that I'm the most familiar with.
Okay, if I may, Johan, I can, because I mean, what's happening is that, and I can put a link also, I mean, UNDP has extensive work on WASH, but we are also working in silos sometimes, we need to admit. But I'm sometimes blaming this on the donors as well, as we are still heavily project funded. So what we're trying to do with our climate promise is really also to accompany countries also. And we actually have support from Sweden and from Sida to have a more integrated approach to work on environment and climate and nature at the heart of development. And this is something that we would want to put at the forefront, to give also flexible funding that allows us to integrate these parts and not work in silos as we sometimes tend to do because of the way we are funded.
Thank you. Another question. I think anyone who feels sort of touched by this could respond. And I think this is an important aspect. The question is about many climate impacts are by nature transboundary. They cross borders. They are regional. They cannot be dealt with by individual countries on their own. So to what extent do you have a regional or transboundary dimension in your support to developing countries? So this would go to any one of the three sort of development partners here, Sida, UNDP, or World Bank.
I can start off if you want to, Yuan. I think we are one of the few donors still having a strong regional support through, and also being guided by regional strategies. I mean, we have that in Asia, we have it in Africa, we have it now new Latin America regional strategy coming up, and then one for the Middle East. And there, I think the whole added value of having regional strategies, of course, is that you can work on transboundary issues in a much more strategic way, and if you only have bilateral support, of course, and also tackle, I mean, in Asia, for example, the shared resources like the Mekong River, and how that both politically but from other perspective is a very challenging resource to handle, and where transboundary cooperation is needed. So yes, I think we do, and especially important when you talk about environment and climate change, of course, because it's all transboundary somehow. Many of it.
Yeah. Anyone from an African perspective? This, I mean, obviously, it has to be part of a regional framework within the African Union or any of the sub-regional organizations. To what extent is there active collaboration between neighbors here? But Pacifica, if you would like to comment.
Yes, thank you very much, Johan. In terms of collaboration, I think we have regional strategies and also regional policies and a vision that guide our action. But over and above the policies and strategies, we have also transboundary projects, and I've seen this transboundaries project in the Masai Mara, Serengeti ecosystem, and also in Lake Victoria basin, which is shared by several countries. And I've also seen this in the oceans, where a program is actually looking at Western Indian Ocean resources across the region through the Nairobi Convention. So these are common. However, I think in some cases, I think a lot is still needed for enhancement. A case in point like Lake Turkana in the north. There are some regions where we really need to enhance that regional collaboration. But we're also governed by IGAD, which is the one and the Climate Prediction Center, and the one that is actually coordinating all climate action in the region. And some elements of it is also coordinated through NEPAD and also the African Union Commission. So that is how we work at regional level, but also we have programs which are funded by partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question about loss and damage. which obviously is a pretty contentious issue in some circles. The fact that countries are now suffering impact and damage that goes beyond what would have happened without climate change. And we know there's now a mechanism, the Warsaw mechanism within the UNFCCC, but it's not a financed mechanism. I think it's important to highlight issues and so on. But the notion of sort of loss and damage related finance is not yet there. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I may comment, but I mean, I have no better thing to say that this has been part of the negotiation. But as you say, I mean, it has been a very tricky part of the negotiation. I think Sweden has been leading on this as well. And as we have said along this call, and also given the situation that we're in now with the socioeconomic, but also, as I said, the looming debt crisis, I really see that this will also once again be part of the negotiations, the upcoming negotiations. But I'm not sure how to foresee that this will come from, the additional funding promised, the 100 billion. We haven't mentioned them, but they are, of course, part of the discussion as well, alongside with this. And I think many member states will be reluctant to actually move into something that can be legally binding in this regard. So I think while there is a reason, I think, for many countries to have this discussion in the name of just climate justice, we need to be realistic and really work in parallel how to drive finance. And I put also a link to our finance sector hub, where we have a lot of instruments. I just mentioned one of them, the SDG Impact, where we're trying also to use the UN platforms alongside, of course, with, I mean, Luis was mentioning, we're not a development financing institution as the World Bank and other, but we work increasingly closely, I must say, and we're incredibly happy that we're doing that. So how we can drive then additional and finance through the investments done through development cooperation and climate finance is incredibly important.
Thank you. Let me move to Luis. I'm not going to ask you to have an opinion or a World Bank position on loss and damage financing, but I'm going to ask you about the regional dimension of extreme events, weather events particularly, and to what extent you are able to sort of conduct a regional dialogue on these issues. One very concrete example is, of course, the locust invasion that we have seen in the Horn of Africa and also in the Arab Peninsula over the past year or so, which is a truly regional event which requires collaboration but also affects some fragile states and states in conflict. So to what extent do you manage to sort of maintain this kind of regional perspective in your work? I think you're muted. Yes. Sorry, we can't hear you. It looks as if you are unmuted, but I cannot hear you. Okay, let's leave it for the moment then, and let me go back to Sida and ask about we have a question stating that the NDCs are, of course, a kind of overall framework for climate action, but it all needs to be sort of broken down and become implemented and become operational at the most local level. And it needs to be accompanied by implementation plans, such as the national adaptation plans for action and so on. And Ulrika, could you say something about this? Translating framework and strategies into practical implementation on the ground, which often includes working with local entities, including local government and civil society.
you mean how we at Sida would handle that? I think it really varies, and I maybe I should, many know that from before, but we are governed by bilateral, regional, and global strategies that are decided on by the government for normally a 5-year period. And those, of course, in the when you operationalize the strategy, you have certain areas of work which you focus on. But then that usually, I mean, more and more strategies have environment and climate change as goals in the strategies, and we are developing or supporting programs within work of adaptation, also mitigation. But to answer your question, I think it really depends on the process in the country, and also what, of course, from their side is asked for when it comes to, for example, supporting the national adaptation plans, or we try to look at actually how much support we have to that. It's really difficult because a lot of our adaptation support would support a national adaptation plan indirectly, and that the same goes for the NDCs. We don't support that many NDCs per se, but a lot of activities contributing to the NDC. So, I mean, that's maybe a general comment, but that's what I can say, I think.
We now only have 5 minutes left, or 4 minutes, and I'll give you each 1 minute at the most for any final comments that you would like to make. If we had a bit more time, I would have asked also about what does the direct access to climate finance mean in terms of the role that you play in your collaboration with governments. But we'll leave that to our next webinar. So please let me begin again with you, Pacifica, just your concluding comment. It seems that Pacifica, did you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I was still muted. I didn't hear you.
Okay.
So I think so I just want to thank you.
I'm inviting the panelists to give just your final 1 minute.
Yes, thank you very much for this meeting. And I think from where we are going, we still need a lot of coordination in donor programming and support, so that the actions are targeted. And mostly also in the continent of Africa, there's a big gap in data. So much as we are trying to respond to the impacts of climate change, we also need a lot of academic research and other support in order to make informed decisions and to enhance coordination, particularly between national and subnational government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pacifica. So Ulrika, please. Modell.
No, just thanking for this opportunity, and hope that we will get back and discuss. I think that, Sweden has an important role to play, and we need to put climate change. And as you said in the very beginning, I believe, Johan, I mean, the NDCs are the practical instrument. The climate negotiations are the negotiations that actually take place and work still in the international community, and that shows that we can have some kind of rules-based world order, and we really need climate action. So I really would like, us to, as technical people, to move this also into the political discussion and really move the pieces that we need to move to make this at the heart of attention and have that whole of government approach. And I think it's really lessons learned if you think about Sweden just having a coordinated way of doing this in government recently, the past year.
Yes, I think that's a very important reminder to all of us. Luis, let's see if we can hear you now. For some reason, you are unmuted, but we cannot hear you. So, yeah, sorry about that. Anyone who would like to contact Luis directly and ask a question, I think can find him through the GFDRR link at the World Bank. But thank you, Luis. So finally, Ulrika from Sida.
Yes, I don't know if Luis waved there, but anyway, maybe he can write in the chat, maybe concluding remarks. I think so much important has been said. I'm so happy we had this 1.5 hour together. It just shows me, at least, that we need just to step up. Like Ulrika said also, I mean, climate action is key. It's key for Sida, it's key for many development cooperation actors. And I think what we need to do is coordinate much more we need to coordinate between sectors, we need to coordinate between donors, we need to have the integrated approach. I think that's key for success in terms of how we work across ministries. And also I think we need to work between donors is also to build upon platforms we have. I haven't mentioned OECD DAC, for example, which is a really important, I think, to move as donors in this direction on the Paris alignment work, but also in terms of other work needed, but also for us, I think at Sida, with the assignment we have to look more at how we can work more in a transformative way in terms of the Paris alignment work. I think we have a lot to do and a lot to build upon related to what we've been talking about today. So I look forward to further discussions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulrika. I think that's a really good ending, a call for action, but action needs to be done jointly together. There's no other way of achieving this. So thank you, everybody. The report that I mentioned on the paper is now in the chat box. So if anyone would like to have a look at that, it was put there by Mats, and you'll find it. And by that, I thank everybody, panelists and participants, and everybody who asked questions. And I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.